From the Terracotta Army of the first emperor to the burning ruins of the capital, witness the epic rise and catastrophic fall of China's first golden age. Discover how the Han Dynasty forged the Silk Road, battled nomadic empires, and ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. In the early years of the 3rd century, specifically around 207 AD, a Chinese poet named Cao Zhi embarked on a journey back to his birthplace, the city of Luoyang. At that time, China was in a state of total chaos, with the armies of competing warlords tearing the nation apart, so his trip could not have been an easy one. Cao Zhi was actually the son of a dominant warlord in the central plains of China, but he was also a notorious drunkard. He had humiliated his family to such a degree that he was exiled, forcing him to return to the only other familiar place he had left, his hometown. Luoyang had once been an incredibly prosperous location. For hundreds of years, poets had described its energetic life and leafy avenues filled with blossoms, which led up to magnificent palaces and temples adorned with thousands of bronze sculptures. It had served as the capital of China during a golden age of emperors that lasted for more than 400 years. Cao Zhi had heard rumors that Luoyang had suffered during the recent wars, yet when he came over the crest of the Mang Mountains to the north, nothing could have prepared him for the reality below. The entire city of Luoyang was a blackened ruin. He later composed a poem regarding what he witnessed. He described climbing the ridge of the Mang Mountains and looking down on the city, noting that in Luoyang, the palaces and houses were reduced to burnt ash. Walls and fences were broken and gaping, while thorns and brambles shot up toward the sky. To the foot soldier, the blackened ruins of Luoyang became an emblem of the golden age that had now passed. Only decades earlier, China had been ruled by a single emperor from the Han Dynasty during a period of trade and prosperity. The Han were the first lasting dynasty to unite China under one banner, and people believed that this golden age would never end. But now, the poet Cao Zhi walked among the ruins and ravaged fields of the former capital and felt his memories rise up from the soot-stained stones. He wrote that he did not see elders from former days, only young men. He turned aside because the straight road was lost, and the fields were overgrown, likely never to be plowed again. He had been away such a long time that he did not know which street was which. It was sad and ugly. The empty fields stretched 1,000 miles without the smoke of a chimney. Thinking of the house he lived in all those years, his breath caught, and he could not speak. As he walked amongst the wreckage, he surely questioned how the initial grand era of Imperial China reached such a catastrophic finale. What drove the inhabitants of Luoyang to abandon their home, leaving it to be consumed by flames and decay into the soil? And he must have wondered if the glorious epic of the emperors would ever reappear in the ages that followed. In this series, we examine ancient societies that climbed to the heights of power only to crumble into history's dust. The goal is to uncover the similarities between them and identify exactly what triggered their downfall. Furthermore, we seek to understand the perspective of those who were there to watch their civilization vanish. For this specific story, we are going to examine the fascinating history of China's Han Dynasty, an Iron Age kingdom that established the first genuine imperial authority in the region. We will trace the journey of this incredible society as it rose from the chaotic warring states of the Bronze Age and extended its reach to make initial, tentative connections with the empires of the West. Finally, we will investigate the events that eventually caused the towering temples and ornate palaces of China's first emperors to come crashing down in a blaze of ash and fire. If you have ever watched a video of a car accident played in slow motion, you will have a good concept of the geological origins of this story. Visualize two vehicles inching toward one another frame by frame, with the crash test dummies staring blankly while strapped securely into their seats. When the collision finally occurs, the solid metal of both cars ripples and buckles together. Our narrative begins with exactly this kind of crash, occurring in the slowest motion imaginable. Until roughly 180 million years ago, India was a component of a massive supercontinent known as Gondwana, which spanned a large portion of the southern hemisphere. However, between 180 million and 160 million years ago, a gigantic plume of magma rose from deep within the Earth's liquid mantle and began to shift the crustal plates resting above it. Gondwana shattered, and the landmass that constitutes modern India ripped away, drifting out into the ocean. Initially, India traveled north slowly, moving at a rate of about 5 centimeters annually. Around 80 million years ago, however, the pace accelerated. Scientists believe this occurred partly because the Indian plate is relatively thin, estimated to be only 70 to 100 kilometers deep. This is roughly half the thickness of the other plates that comprised Gondwana. Powered by the massive currents of molten rock beneath it, this lighter plate plowed northward at a speed of 15 centimeters per year. While this is roughly the rate at which human hair grows, in the context of continental plates, it was a speeding juggernaut. Directly in the path of this runaway plate sat the continent of what is now Asia. These two massive landmasses rushed toward each other with the same unavoidable momentum as our speeding cars, and the impact took place somewhere between 70 and 35 million years ago. Over millions of years, the Indian plate made contact with the Asian mainland inch by inch. Along a collision zone stretching for 2,000 kilometers, the rock of the Asian plate began to crumple as the Indian plate was crushed underneath it. The land buckled and shook, pushing up the highest mountain range in the world, the Himalayas. This crash is actually still in progress today, and behind the impact zone defined by the dramatic snow-capped peaks of the world's tallest mountains, the Earth's crust has been shoved upward like soil in front of a plow. The result is a massive, arid steppe, a table of land interrupted by glaciers and salty lakes with an average altitude exceeding 4,500 meters, known as the Tibetan Plateau. The creation of this plateau had several enormous consequences for the climate of the region. Rain clouds traveling from the Indian Ocean find it impossible to traverse the Himalayas, so the mountains create a huge reservoir of clouds to the south. This brings the annual monsoon rains to India and Southeast Asia. Behind the mountains to the north, however, the situation is drastically different. Here, the Himalayas create what is known as a rain shadow, an area where huge deserts have formed because almost no rain can fall. But the real setting of our story lies to the east of this plateau, where another unique landscape was born. On its eastern edge, the Tibetan Plateau drops off dramatically into a rolling landscape of mountains and valleys. Eventually, this transitions into a massive stretch of wide, silty flatlands. These plains extend for nearly 2,000 kilometers between the snowy walls of the plateau in the west and the Pacific Ocean in the east. This area is home to several massive rivers, fed by the tens of thousands of glaciers located in the highlands. Functioning like a massive natural water tower, the Tibetan Plateau releases a consistent stream of glacial meltwater. This water carves its way through rugged mountain passes before spilling onto the lowlands in long, winding paths. Of these magnificent waterways, the Yellow River and the Yangtze are the most formidable. The Yangtze ranks as the longest river in Asia and comes in third globally, trailing only the Amazon and the Nile. Starting at an altitude of 5 kilometers, it travels 6,300 kilometers from the peaks to the ocean, cutting straight through the heart of modern China. As it winds through deep valleys and striking stone gorges, the Yangtze remains a comparatively stable and calm river. Throughout history, it has kept a steady path, emptying into the sea at the exact same location for the past 11 million years. However, its sister river to the north, the Yellow River, is far more volatile and dangerous. In its upper sections, the river traverses the Huangtu, or Yellow Earth Plateau, a landscape defined by soil that erodes more easily than almost anywhere else. Consequently, this waterway carries the highest volume of sand and silt on Earth, turning the water the distinct yellow-brown hue that gives the river its name. While this massive amount of sediment renders the northern Chinese plains incredibly fertile, it also creates significant difficulties. As the river flows, silt accumulates on the bottom, causing the riverbed to gradually rise until it sometimes sits higher than the surrounding terrain. When that occurs, the banks fail, sending floodwaters surging across vast stretches of the countryside. In the most extreme instances, the river can completely shift its direction, sweeping across the landscape for hundreds of kilometers and obliterating everything in its way. Historical records show that such catastrophic events happen roughly once per century. Evidence of human activity in this area dates back as far as 27,000 years. Around 8000 BC, people began cultivating rice along the Yangtze, while millet, barley, and wheat were better adapted to the drier northern soils. The farming of these high-calorie crops supported the rise of the advanced Jiahu culture, who were experimenting with written symbols on cave walls as early as 7000 BC. The 4th and 5th millennia saw the founding of the first real villages, sparking a population boom in the region. Around 3000 BC, the Bronze Age arrived in the area, introducing the technique of smelting bronze from tin and copper. The Longshan culture later domesticated water buffalo for field labor and developed both the plow and advanced irrigation methods, further boosting the productivity of the already rich land. During the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, early Chinese villages expanded into towns, which eventually evolved into the first major cities. According to ancient Chinese cosmology, the territory between the Yellow River and the Yangtze represented the center of all benevolence. They expressed this concept with the term Huazia, which implies a sense of beauty and grandeur. An ancient writer named Yin Yue articulated this clearly. Inside is the Chinese Empire, and outside are other barbarous nations. He described these barbarians as covetous and greedy, with hair hanging down their bodies and coats buttoned on the left, possessing human faces but the hearts of beasts. The ancient view held that, as one traveled further from this center, the virtuous qualities of the people diminished. Specifically, the Book of Documents, a text dating back to roughly 500 BC, offers an incredibly detailed map of this perspective. It explains that the moral character of the inhabitants fades in regular intervals of 500 li, which is roughly 400 kilometers. Starting at the core, the first 500 li makes up the imperial domain. The next 500 li outward is the nobles' territory, followed by the domain of peace, a region devoted to learning and moral responsibilities. However, as you continue moving away from the capital in these 400-kilometer blocks, the atmosphere changes. The subsequent 500 li is called the domain of restraint. Distinct tribes hold the first 300 li here, while exiled criminals inhabit the remaining 200. The final, most distant 500 li is classified as the wild domain. To the south, this wild area encompassed the hills past the Yangtze River, populated by groups the early Chinese labeled southern barbarians. In the west, the wild domain was a frozen plateau where survival was nearly impossible, while the north featured the Gobi Desert, stretching out toward the vast grassy steppes of Siberia and Mongolia. A Mongolian poet from the 5th century named Altan would later describe this barren, flat terrain. He wrote of the sky hanging over the great steppe like the walls of a tent beneath dark mountains, depicting a gray expanse and a wide landscape where oxen and sheep roam through windswept grass. Consequently, the early Chinese were geographically boxed in by western mountains, southern and eastern jungles and seas, and northern deserts. Nevertheless, within this isolated fertile square, their civilization prospered. The first millennium BC in China marked an era of intense transformation and enthusiastic innovation. The massive population necessitated a complex society, which quickly drove technological advancements. For instance, they developed a method to coat bronze with chromium to prevent rust, alongside other inventions. Innovations like the blast furnace and bellows eventually paved the way for cast iron, which replaced bronze as a more affordable alternative. In the agricultural sector, iron implements and machines, such as the multi-tube seed drill, sparked a massive boom in production. The creation of complex pulley systems and differential gears enabled water wheels to drive all sorts of machinery, from grain mills to heavy furnaces. These mechanics even allowed for the creation of clever robotic toys. For example, one early emperor was laid to rest with a complete mechanical orchestra that used running water to play instruments and sing through piped mouths. Engineers also designed a vehicle known as the south-pointing chariot. It featured an onboard gearing system that kept a directional arm pointing south without relying on magnets. The crossbow was born during this era as well, becoming a standard weapon for Chinese troops almost 2 millennia before appearing in European warfare. Archaeologists have even discovered repeating crossbows that utilized intricate triggers to shoot several bolts rapidly without reloading. Another inventor even devised a primitive pinhole camera to safely view solar eclipses. Historians call this age of creativity the Spring and Autumn period, but that rapid technological progress soon led to chaos. Because iron was now common, making weapons and armor became cheap and easy. Wealthy individuals could now equip massive armies, ushering in a violent era appropriately named the Warring States period. Numerous feudal kingdoms fought and absorbed one another, merging together like droplets of mercury on a table. The historian Sima Qian described this era as a truly dark chapter in Chinese history. The territory was ripped apart by the struggles of warring kingdoms. Men at this time respected trickery and brute force while mocking benevolence and righteousness. Wealth and material objects came first, with humility and courtesy coming last. Some commoners amassed fortunes counted in the hundreds of millions, while the poor starved, unable to find even enough chaff to fill their bellies. Eventually, the landscape settled into 7 major kingdoms locked in perpetual competition. Among these, the 2 most important to our story are the Kingdom of Han and the Kingdom of Qian. For many, it seemed the wars would never end, but out of this violence, the state of Qian rose to eclipse the rest. Qian sat the furthest west, with its back to the steep walls of the Tibetan plateau. Their king, Qin Shi Huang, was an eager reformer who revolutionized his kingdom's society and administration. He worked to reduce the power of landowners and aristocrats, strengthening the central government to collect taxes directly from the peasants. The Qin also adopted the latest military tactics, making unprecedented use of cavalry. Still a rarity in Chinese armies, these mounted units launched guerrilla raids on enemy supply lines and river crossings. Qin Shi Huang waited years to build his power, and when his preparations were complete, he struck with lightning speed. He first attacked the Han, a smaller neighbor to the east, taking their capital in 230 BC. Next, he struck north at the state of Zhao, which surrendered 2 years later, and took the northern state of Yan 2 years after that. Less than a decade after starting his campaign, Qin Shi Huang had conquered all lands between the mountains and the sea. For the first time in history, one man ruled the entire kingdom. Now that he held supreme power, Qin Shi Huang crowned himself as the very first emperor of China. He proclaimed that his status was ordained by divine will, known as Tianming, or the mandate of heaven. In fact, many believe that the modern word China is actually derived from the name of his dynasty, the Qin. Generally, he governed this massive empire using the same methods he had applied to his original kingdom. It was a period defined by aggressive territorial growth and ambitious reforms that expanded the reach of the young empire. However, Emperor Qin's rule faced significant threats. He was targeted in 3 separate assassination plots, barely escaping with his life each time. These attacks fueled an intense paranoia, and he became absolutely terrified of dying. Consequently, he began touring the entire empire, speaking with every sage he could find in hopes of uncovering a secret. He was looking for magic spells or medicine that would unlock eternal life. As he grew older and his health failed, this search turned desperate. He started executing the scholars who provided him with useless elixirs. At one stage, he dispatched a fleet of ships carrying hundreds of youths into the southern seas to find the legendary land of Pinglai. He believed a 1,000-year-old magician lived there, but the fleet never returned, probably a smart move considering how the emperor treated those who disappointed him. In his final years, he became petrified of evil spirits. To hide from them, he ordered workers to construct a vast network of tunnels connecting his 200 palaces so he could travel unseen. This fear eventually morphed into brutal tyranny. He focused his rage on the intellectuals who failed to make him immortal. It is recorded that he even burned the books in the capital's libraries. The historian Sima Qian later wrote with bitterness about how Confucian scholars despised the Qin for destroying the classic Book of Odes. They also destroyed the Book of Documents and ruthlessly executed the scholars who tried to expand upon them. Meanwhile, the general public despised the regime's brutal laws, causing the entire world to rise up in potential rebellion. During this period, speaking negatively about the Qin became a common occurrence everywhere. While embarking on his fourth inspection tour of eastern China, the emperor fell gravely ill. Historians believe his court physicians had been feeding him pills containing liquid mercury, under the false impression that the metal would prolong his life. As we know today, mercury is actually incredibly toxic. Long-term exposure can destroy the entire nervous system, leading to depression and physical tremors, as well as delirium and hallucinations. If Qin Shi Huang was indeed consuming mercury, it would explain some of the bizarre obsessions he displayed in his final years. Ironically, when the emperor's condition worsened, his doctors likely increased his dosage. China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, passed away in the year 210 BC, and his dynasty essentially perished with him. Despite its massive historical impact, the Qin dynasty lasted barely more than 15 years. The first emperor left behind highly specific instructions regarding his burial. To this day, these remains stand as a monument to his greatness, but also to the madness that plagued his later life. He was laid to rest in a massive mausoleum, considered one of the most extraordinary engineering feats of the ancient world. It was constructed as a colossal underground palace, designed to be an exact replica of the residence he occupied while alive. This buried complex was populated with life-sized models of the bureaucrats and courtiers who had served the king. Sculpted from terracotta with meticulous precision, their dead eyes remain open, staring out for eternity. The underground palace was also protected by an army of thousands of clay soldiers, each sporting a unique face. Estimates suggest that Qin Shi Huang was interred with a total of 8,000 soldiers, along with 130 chariots pulled by 520 horses and another 150 cavalrymen. This constituted a full squad of royal bodyguards meant to defend their ruler in the afterlife. The site even included a copy of the imperial stables, where the bodies of real horses were buried alongside terracotta sculptures of kneeling grooms. Nearby, archaeologists have discovered a massive graveyard for the countless enslaved laborers who died while being forced to build this complex. Deep in the center of the underground palace lay the emperor's burial chamber. The historian Sima Qian described how the floor was painted to map out the geography of China, using flowing streams of mercury to represent the rivers. The tomb was packed with rare artifacts and magnificent treasures. Artisans were commanded to rig crossbows and arrows, primed to automatically shoot anyone who dared to enter. Mercury was utilized to mimic the 100 rivers, including the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the Great Sea, which were engineered to flow mechanically. The ceiling depicted the celestial constellations, while the ground below mirrored the features of the land. Although the tomb of Qin Shi Huang has never been opened, scientific analysis has revealed that the soil of the mound covering it holds an extraordinarily high concentration of mercury. One study even claims that the distribution of mercury within the mound aligns perfectly with the geographic positions of China's actual rivers. The concept of a unified empire of China was still quite new, and during Qin Shi Huang's life, unity was just a thin veneer over a deeply divided land. With the death of the first emperor, it seemed the entire imperial structure might come crashing down. The Qin state started to fall apart, and China fractured into 18 separate kingdoms, all of which began warring among themselves once again. It appeared as though the ancient age of chaos was about to return. However, history had other plans, largely due to a rather unassuming character, a common man named Liu Bang. There was not much to distinguish Liu Bang during his early years. Records show he was born in the Kingdom of Han and had a fondness for alcohol. Nevertheless, he eventually rose to the position of a local official. Following the death of Qin Shi Huang, he continued his work as a sheriff. He received orders to escort a gang of convict laborers to the massive construction site where the late emperor's tomb was being built. However, disaster struck during the journey when several prisoners managed to run away. Liu Bang realized that arriving at the destination with missing prisoners would guarantee his punishment for incompetence. Faced with this outcome, he made a bold choice. He smashed the shackles of the remaining captives and announced that he would rather fight against the empire as a rebel than turn them over to a life of forced labor. Grateful for their freedom, many of the men grabbed weapons and enlisted in his cause right then and there. Liu Bang and his new followers hid out at Mount Mangdang, establishing their base within the crumbling ruins of an ancient fortress. From this vantage point, they observed the Qin dynasty disintegrating around them. Eventually, they aligned themselves with a rebel king to fight the remnants of the old regime, and Liu Bang demonstrated incredible prowess on the battlefield. In fact, the ancient historian Sima credits his military victories to otherworldly forces. Legend says that while Liu Bang was still a peasant, he slew a massive serpent. A spirit then appeared, proclaiming that the snake was the son of the White Emperor, and the man who killed him was the son of the Red Emperor. Furthermore, at the start of his revolt, he prayed at the altar of the earth in the city of Fang, offering sacrifices to the warrior deity Kai Yu and smearing sacrificial blood on his battle flags and drums. Whatever the true source of his power, Liu Bang succeeded in seizing the Qin city of Xiongnu for the resistance and was crowned its king as a reward. The civil war dragged on, devolving into a complex web of alliances and rivalries, until only two major powers remained, Liu Bang and his rivals from the Chu clan. These two great warlords effectively split China's territory between them along the Han Canal. Even today, Chinese chess players refer to the two sides of the board as Chu and Han rather than black and white. After a tense few months of stalemate where the players calculated their next steps, Liu Bang made his move. He marched across the Han Canal and struck the Chu forces. He emerged victorious, and against heavy odds after 8 years of grueling warfare, China was reunified in the year 202 BC. Liu Bang, the former small-town sheriff, proclaimed himself the next emperor of China. He would only visit his hometown in the state of Han one more time. During that visit, he composed the following poem. A great wind came forth, the clouds rose on high. Now that my might rules all within the seas, I have returned to my old village. Where will I find brave men to guard the four corners of my land? Upon his coronation, he adopted Han as the dynasty's name, honoring his home province. Establishing his court in the city of Chang'an, he took the new imperial title Han Geazu. The age of the Han had officially launched. Before we move on, let's take a moment to discuss the historical sources available for this era. The population during the Han period was surprisingly literate. Historians believe that in these early years, at least one person in every family recognized a few hundred characters, sufficient for handling daily tasks like reading calendars, personal letters, and official government notices. Since paper had not yet been invented, books from this time were inscribed on strips of flattened bamboo. These strips were tied together with thread to form long, clattering mats that could be rolled into cylinders and wrapped in cloth. This method of using vertical bamboo slats helps explain why traditional Chinese writing flows from top to bottom. From the very beginning, colleges were established for the aristocracy, and charitable schools were created for the poor, while the emperor funded scribes and scholars to compile majestic historical chronicles. As a result, this early period of Chinese history is exceptionally well documented. One of the most remarkable sources was written in the 1st century BC by the court's chief astrologer, a man named Sima Qian. You may recognize his name, as we have mentioned him previously. His masterpiece is known as the Records of the Grand Historian. It is a massive archive covering 2,000 years of history, starting with the Yellow Emperor, the legendary ancestor of all Chinese people. Sima Qian is an energetic and colorful storyteller who frequently invents dialogue for his historical figures. However, we must read his work, and other histories of the time, with a note of caution. Since Sima Qian wrote primarily during the reign of Emperor Wu, his accounts of that specific ruler often act as flattering official propaganda. Yet, he was a sharp observer of human nature and used a clever tactic to allow criticism of powerful figures to slip through. He organized his chapters by biography, knowing that the various lords, ladies, and even the emperor himself were unlikely to read any chapters other than the ones dedicated to themselves. Sima Qian would fill those specific chapters with praise and flattery, hiding his harsh criticisms in chapters dedicated to other people. However, it seems this strategy didn't always work. Only one chapter of the records has failed to survive to the present day, the one focusing on Emperor Wu himself. It is impossible to know if Sima Qian was too afraid to write it, or if the emperor read something in those pages he detested and had the document destroyed. Another incredibly useful document is the Hanshu, or the Book of Han. This was compiled in the 1st century AD by a court official named Ban Gu and his sister Ban Zhao, who is the first known female historian in China. Like almost all histories that followed, the Book of Han was modeled on Sima Qian's work. It chronicles Chinese history from the reign of the first Han Emperor, Han Geazu, up to the year 23 AD. This brings us to our final major historical text, the Hu Hanshu, or Book of Later Han. It was penned by a 5th century politician and historian named Fan Yi. This work chronicles the rest of the dynasty until the year 220 AD. Unlike the authors of the Book of Han, who lived through the events they recorded, Fan Yi was looking back from a distance of nearly 2 centuries. He relied on earlier documents and histories, much like how we view the Napoleonic Wars today. Because these court scholars often worked under the terrifying supervision of their emperors, we have to cross-reference their stories with archaeology. However, thanks to their diligent work, a clear picture emerges regarding the collapse of China's first great dynasty. When the Han Dynasty took control of a unified China in 206 BC, they didn't just inherit the Qin Empire, they inherited its disasters. Sima Qian, in his Records of the Grand Historian, describes a grim scene. The able-bodied men were exhausted from war, leaving the elderly and children to haul supplies. Wealth was scarce, and labor was grueling. The economy was so shattered that the emperor couldn't find 4 matching horses for his carriage, forcing his generals to travel in ox carts. Inflation skyrocketed, and wealthy merchants exploited the situation by hoarding grain to drive prices even higher. Yet the most dangerous issue was the constant looming shadow of the north. These were the Xiongnu, a name sometimes translated as the Huns. Back around 6000 BC, people on the Eurasian steppes domesticated wild horses, forming a powerful symbiotic bond with the animals over the millennia. They became nomads, moving vast populations between grazing lands without relying on farming. By the 1st millennium BC, these horse-riding groups posed a severe military threat to the settled societies of the Chinese plains. Sima Qian describes them as mountain barbarians who migrated in search of water and pasture. Lacking walled cities, permanent homes, or agriculture, they wore animal hides and felt. With no written language, their agreements were strictly verbal. From childhood, boys learned to ride sheep and hunt vermin with bows, ensuring every adult man was a skilled cavalry warrior. Chinese armies, despite their technological advantages, found these mobile forces incredibly difficult to fight. Sima Qian notes their tactics with disdain. They advanced when winning but retreated without shame if the tide turned, caring only for self-advantage rather than propriety or honor. Border kingdoms faced constant raids, leading the Chinese to resort to desperate measures like building defensive walls as early as the 7th century BC. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, boldly approached this problem by connecting these scattered fragments into a single barrier by 210 BC. While this offered temporary relief, the Xiongnu tribes were simultaneously uniting under a supreme leader called the Qian. This title would eventually evolve into Khan, the same title later used by figures like Genghis Khan. Controlling the largest land empire on Earth at the time, the Qian prepared for war. Seizing the opportunity during the post-Qin civil wars, Xiongnu horsemen flooded past the border walls into undefended territory. When Han Geazu restored order, the Qian briefly paused but attacked again 5 years later. Nearly 60, Emperor Geazu led his forces to Shanxi to stop the looting and burning. Confident from his civil war victories, he expected success, but he was about to discover that fighting the swift Xiongnu hordes was a unique nightmare. Marching into the mountain passes, Geazu fell into an ambush. Without warning, thousands of Xiongnu cavalry thundered down the valley sides, tearing into the Chinese forces from all directions. The ancient poet Yuan, writing in the 3rd century BC, captures the horror of such battles, describing enemies rolling in like clouds, arrows falling thick as rain, and lines breaking amidst dead horses and fallen warriors. Utterly beaten, Geazu retreated to the walled city of Beideng. Locked inside, he watched fearfully from the ramparts as the Xiongnu besieged the city. For 7 days, the dust and low drumming of thousands of hooves filled the air. It seemed the Han Dynasty might end even faster than the Qin. However, survival came through creative diplomacy. Spies were sent to bribe the Qianyu's wife, bringing him to the negotiating table. The siege was lifted, and a humbled Geazu returned to his capital. He abandoned the idea of a military solution, adopting a policy of diplomacy and appeasement known as Hexi, or marriage alliance. This required sending massive annual tributes of silk, wine, and rice, luxuries the Xiongnu couldn't produce in their barren lands. Even more humiliating was the condition that the Han emperor must send his eldest daughter to marry the Qian, a practice repeated with every new barbarian ruler. For roughly 100 years, this policy bought an uneasy peace. In exchange for ending the raids, the Han Empire stabilized and grew rich. Sima records that by 130 BC, granaries and treasuries were overflowing. Strings of coins rotted from disuse, and grain spoiled outside full warehouses. Yet, Sima also observed that peak prosperity often signals the start of decay. The policy of appeasement eventually failed to protect the empire. Large armies of Xiongnu horsemen resumed raiding, striking deep into northern provinces, and once coming within 160 kilometers of the capital. During the reign of Emperor Jing, over 10,000 border citizens were abducted and enslaved. A poet and politician of the time named Jia Yi expressed the era's bitterness regarding this humiliation. He described the empire as hanging upside down. The Son of Heaven should be the head, and the barbarians the feet. However, because the arrogant Xiongnu invaded at will while receiving tribute, the feet were effectively placed above the head. Hanging upside down like this, he argued, was a profound disgrace. Despite his arguments about the disgrace of their situation, Yi and those who shared his views found themselves largely disregarded by the Chinese court. Most of the nobility could not forget the disastrous ambush at Beideng under Emperor Geazu, and their fear of the Xiongnu led them to stick firmly to a policy of appeasement. However, a small but loud faction favoring war was slowly coalescing within the palace. They simply needed the right leader to listen, and they finally found one in Emperor Wu. In his later years, Emperor Wu was an intimidating presence. Traditional art depicts him as a barrel-chested man draped in swathes of imperial blue silk, with a heavy black beard and a delicate mustache beneath a furrowed brow. Yet, when he first took the throne in 141 BC, he was merely 16 years old. He made up for his youth with sheer determination, ruling for 54 years, a record that would stand in China for almost 2 millennia. During this era, he drove rapid centralizing reforms, establishing an imperial university for scholars and an imperial music bureau to oversee poetry and culture. However, all these cultural achievements meant nothing if he couldn't solve the Xiongnu crisis. In 133 BC, at the age of 24, Emperor Wu called a council to determine the next move. For the first time, the young ruler sided with the pro-war faction, deciding on a bold, aggressive new strategy. The Han Empire would stop cowering behind walls and confront the enemy head-on. His plan involved a trap to lure the ruling Qian south with his army. This incredibly risky operation relied on total secrecy. The bait was May, a wealthy frontier trading post bridging China and the northern deserts. To sell the deception, the Chinese hired a local smuggler to act as a double agent. This man traveled into Xiongnu territory, likely securing an audience with the fearsome Qian in his yak-skin tent, surrounded by crackling fires. The smuggler bowed and delivered a rehearsed lie. He claimed to have killed the magistrate of Mei and seized control, offering the entire city to the Xiongnu Empire if the Qian would simply come and take it. Ecstatic at the news, the Qian agreed to ride out and claim Mei immediately. At first, the Chinese plan seemed to be working perfectly. However, as the Qian marched deeper into Han lands, he sensed something was wrong. His horsemen faced no resistance, and as they approached Mei, the roads were eerily empty. The fields were full of cattle, yet there were no herdsmen to guard them. Suspicious, the Qian halted his advance and sent out scouts. They captured a Han soldier who, under interrogation, revealed the terrifying truth. The entire military force of the Han Empire, 300,000 infantry and chariots, was hidden nearby, waiting for him to step into the snare. The Qian immediately ordered a retreat. Although the ambush was blown and Han forces burst out to give chase, their infantry could not match the speed of the Xiongnu horses. The Qian escaped back to his lands without losing a single man. Shaking with rage upon crossing back into the desert, the Qian resolved to take revenge. He launched a devastating series of raids on Chinese border towns, leaving pillars of black smoke rising over the horizon for weeks. The ambush had been a failure, and the mood at court turned grim as the pro-war faction took the blame. Yet, with their true intentions now revealed, the Chinese had no choice but to commit to war. The records of the Grand Historian detail the fallout, noting that after the failed ambush at Mei, peaceful relations ended and the barbarians began constant plundering raids. Armies had to be dispatched repeatedly, causing extreme hardship for the empire. To win this war, the Han realized they had to evolve. The infantry and chariot armies that dominated the civil wars in the river plains were now obsolete. War chariots were useless in the rocky northern terrain, and foot soldiers were too slow for the open desert. Instead, the Chinese pivoted to cavalry. They began developing large armored horse units to match their Xiongnu enemies. Emperor Wu recognized that the horse was the defining weapon of this new age, so securing a reliable supply of war horses became a primary government focus. Eventually, he maintained a stable of 300,000 horses, but even that wasn't enough. The government started loaning breeding stock to farmers, allowing them to keep the horses for 3 years in exchange for a share of the foals. They even instituted a policy where a family could exempt up to 3 male members from military service by donating a single horse to the state. This policy soon paid dividends. As the historical records note, Han generals were soon leading forces of 20,000 to 30,000 cavalrymen in annual attacks against the nomads. The only chariots remaining in the Han army were heavy, armored versions used as mobile fortresses. These could be arranged in ring formations on the battlefield to shield archers and crossbowmen from Xiongnu charges. The war for the north raged for decades, but the Han slowly gained the upper hand. While the desert terrain was merely strategic for the Han, it was economically vital for the Xiongnu. An imperial edict celebrating a victory illustrates this shift. It describes the general of swift cavalry leading troops at Mount Julian, gazing out over the sea of sand. He executed the enemy leader, seized his war drums and flags, captured 70,000 prisoners, and snatched their food supplies after penetrating deep into their territory. As the war dragged on, the Xiongnu Empire suffered a sharp decline in the trade, taxes, and tribute payments that had built their power. Consequently, they were forced to raise taxes on the regions still under their command, which only fueled deep resentment among the population. Smaller tribes within the coalition began to doubt their alliances, wondering if they had backed the losing side. And as the conflict ground on, marginal kingdoms defected as the war's trajectory became obvious. It is here that a slender strip of land sandwiched between the Gobi Desert and the Tibetan Plateau enters the narrative, the Hexi Corridor. Today, this region hosts the G30 highway in Gansu province, and seeing cars speed along this lonely stretch of motorway makes it difficult to visualize that it was once the front line of a battle for the Chinese state's very survival. For an ancient Chinese trader seeking profit in the West, options were incredibly scarce. The Tibetan Plateau formed an insurmountable wall along the empire's length, while the south presented unmapped, impassable jungles and mountains. To the north lay the desert, promising certain death to any traveler foolish enough to attempt a crossing. However, there was one viable path where the Tibetan Plateau finally descends to overlook the Gobi Desert. Here, runoff from the hills formed a chain of fertile oases, offering water and rest for those braving the dangerous journey. Stretching for 1,200 kilometers, the Hexi Corridor was the only northern route to the west, meaning that whoever held the corridor controlled the flow of cross-mountain trade. For centuries, the Xiongnu and other nomads had enriched themselves by taxing this traffic, but now the corridor had become the battleground of a grinding war. For the Chinese, conducting warfare across this landscape presented massive logistical hurdles. A letter sent to a later emperor by a counselor detailed the nightmare of supplying an army in these barren lands. The text described a salty, sandy terrain with scarce water and vegetation, noting that oxen would die within 100 days and that provisions would outweigh what the men could carry. The counselor warned that the freezing winters and high winds of spring required unmanageable amounts of fuel for warmth, while thirst and sickness would plague the troops. Furthermore, the Xiongnu were masters of guerrilla warfare, attacking Chinese supply lines at every opportunity. To push the nomads back along the Hexi Corridor, the Han utilized their greatest strength. They built walls. Extending the existing segments of the Great Wall to run the entire length of the corridor, they created a fortified highway flanked by garrisoned forts. Historical records recall the construction of these massive defenses, noting that the roads were lined with lookout towers, and military colonies were established outside the walls for protection. These sections were not the elegant stone serpents you might picture when imagining the Great Wall, as those famous sections were built much later, after the 14th century. The Han-era fortifications were practical, rough-and-ready structures of rammed earth. Builders packed desert clay and gravel into frames made of rose, willow, and rushes, leaving them to bake in the sun. Yet they were immensely effective, and many still stand magnificent against the barren backdrop, having withstood over 2 millennia of erosion. Every 5 kilometers along the line stood a beacon tower, usually about 7 meters high. If sentries sighted enemy troops, they lit fires to produce smoke by day or bright flames by night. This distress signal would race down the wall in both directions, summoning a Han cavalry army to crush the threat. These walls completely neutralized the fast, mobile tactics of the Xiongnu, restricting their movement and slowly strangling their war machine. By the early decades of the 1st century BC, the Xiongnu Confederation truly began to disintegrate. Former members declared independence, joining the Han in carving up the territory. By 60 BC, the empire had fractured into 5 groups engaged in suicidal civil wars. Finally, in 53 BC, the Qian sent his son to China as a hostage and personally delivered his surrender to the Chinese court 2 years later. It had been over 80 years since the failed ambush at Mei, but the campaign was a remarkable success. A Chinese merchant at this time could now travel a secure, well-maintained road spanning the entire Hexi corridor. Eventually, they would reach the end of the fortifications at a wide portal known as the Yumen Pass, or the Jade Gate. This was the exit from China, and beyond it lay the unknown world. Stepping through the Jade Gate revealed the vast, shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert, which fills the massive geographical feature known as the Tarim Basin. Visible from space as a giant flat oval carved out of the Tibetan plateau, it resembles a great sandy eye in the center of the Asian continent. Today, this desert lies in the far west of modern China in Xinjiang province, bordering Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kashmir. Half the people of the Tarim Basin currently belong to the Uyghur ethnicity, a group with a rich cultural history in the region. Traditional music, like that recorded in the ancient oasis town of Turban, has drifted over these shifting sands for thousands of years as trade caravans passed by. To the ancient Chinese, however, this wild area beyond their walls was known simply as the Western regions. The Taklamakan is the world's second-largest shifting sand desert, with over 85% of its surface comprised of dramatic dunes. Because crossing the center was so difficult, trade caravans, often using Bactrian camels, would skirt the edges, traveling in the shadow of the snowy mountains that rim the basin. These caravans converged on the far side of the desert at the ancient trading city of Kashgar, where a famous stone tower stood. Here, Chinese merchants ended their journey, selling their goods to traders who had crossed the mountains from the exotic lands to the west and knew the dangerous paths into Pakistan and Afghanistan. Many goods originating in China, such as tea, fine carved jade, and the newly developed technology of porcelain, flowed west in this manner even before diplomatic contact was established. But by far, the most prized Chinese export was a miracle material of immense value to the world: silk. Silk is a natural protein fiber produced by the larvae of a specific moth. During their larval stage, these silkworms prefer to feed exclusively on the green leaves of the white mulberry tree. Humans recognized the potential of this remarkable material as early as 3600 BC. Initially, people harvested wild silk from the forests, but purposeful cultivation soon followed. Centuries of breeding transformed the silkworm into a domesticated species. Compared to their wild cousins, domesticated silkworms are larger, digest food more efficiently, lay more eggs, spin larger cocoons, and are more tolerant of human handling. All of this increased silk production capacity tenfold, but unfortunately for the larvae, they will never reach adulthood. When they enter the cocoon phase of their life cycle, they are exterminated, usually by being submerged in boiling water or pierced with a needle. The entire cocoon is then painstakingly unraveled to generate a single, continuous filament that can be spun and woven into fabric. Creating just one silk dress can require up to 2,000 of these cocoons. However, because silk was so soft, luminous, and capable of holding brilliant dyes, it was immediately in massive demand across the globe. Outside of China, this material was valued at many times its own weight in gold. The Han people might have been surprised to learn just how far their textiles traveled. Julius Caesar famously sparked a fashion craze among Roman nobility by wearing a silk cloak to the theater. The Egyptian queen Cleopatra was an avid collector of silk goods, and the fabric has even been discovered in Viking burial sites. Archaeologists have found traces of silk in the hair of an Egyptian mummy from the 21st dynasty, dating back to around 1070 BC. After seizing the Hexi corridor, the Han drove the Xiongnu out of the western regions. They soon absorbed the sandy towns clinging to the edge of the vast desert basin into their empire. Before long, the entire western region was under Han control, and for the first time, China managed its own trade routes to the west. By the end of the 1st century BC, the shape of the Han territory had become quite unique. It comprised the large central plains around the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, but also included the western regions in the Tarim Basin. These two massive areas were connected only by the narrow strip of the Hexi corridor. It was an unusual shape for an empire, but the Han lands had more than doubled in size. They had also subdued the groups they called the Southern Barbarians, occupying the hilly lands south of the Yangtze all the way to the borders of modern Vietnam. Han China was now one of the largest empires on Earth, and other great powers were beginning to pay attention. As the records of the grand historian notes, barbarians of the distant west craned their necks eastward, longing to catch a glimpse of China. Emperor Wu had transformed the state from a fearful, unstable entity into a confident imperial power. However, in his old age, he was plagued by the same paranoia that had afflicted Emperor Qian nearly a century earlier. He began handing out excessive punishments to court members he suspected of spreading rumors. The most tragic case involved Sima Qian, the old historian whose work has guided us through this story. When a general and friend of Sima Qian was captured by the Xiongnu and denounced as a traitor, Sima Qian was the only man in court to defend him. Emperor Wu was enraged by this defiance and sentenced the historian to death. Tradition dictated that a court official should commit suicide before such a sentence could be carried out, but Sima Qian refused. He was determined to finish his great historical text before dying. Eventually, the emperor commuted the sentence to the second most severe punishment, castration and servitude as a eunuch. After this cruel penalty was enacted, Sima Qian took a post as a palace secretary, where he completed the work that stands as the only great record of Emperor Wu's reign. As the emperor's mental state deteriorated, more parallels with Emperor Qin emerged. He toured the country consulting wise men in a fruitless search for the secret to eternal life. It is unknown whether he also consumed mercury pills, but in 88 BC, Emperor Wu fell suddenly ill. He died a year later at the age of 69. An ancient song called Dew on the Garlic Leaf was often performed at royal burials, and we can imagine it being sung at Wu's funeral. It laments how swiftly the dew dries. Though it may fall again tomorrow, the one carried to the grave returns no more. The palace women wept while the court held a solemn wake. To preserve the body, the king was placed in a bath of ice and wrapped in fine silks. Pearls were placed in his mouth, and he was encased in a suit made of small jade plates sewn together with gold thread. He was laid in a magnificent red catalpa wood coffin adorned with ivory and designs of dragons, tigers, the sun, and the moon, while armed eunuchs stood guard. Emperor Wu had built the Han into a global superpower, but he had fallen to the curse of tyranny and paranoia. He was not the first emperor to meet this fate, and he would be far from the last. As is often the case following the long rule of a successful king, Emperor Wu was followed by a string of relatively inept successors. It was under Emperor Cheng that the empire began its first real slide toward disintegration. Cheng was a type of ruler who will soon seem familiar. He was lazy, incompetent, and more interested in cockfighting and chasing palace women than in governing. He left state affairs to his relatives in the Wang clan, who wasted no time gathering immense personal power and wealth. Meanwhile, corrupt officials plagued the government, causing rebellions to break out across the country. Emperor Cheng died in 7 BC. His young nephew took the throne, but by then the Wang family was too powerful. Among them, one man had been launching a personal propaganda campaign to amass vast support among the common people. This was Wang Mang. He was a remarkable character, a Confucian scholar and great speaker who was immensely popular with the peasantry. At one point, the palace received a petition written on 500,000 bamboo rolls demanding Wang Mang be given the highest offices. The source of his popularity is clear. Disillusioned by court corruption, the peasants were desperate for change, and Wang Mang offered it. He believed modern reforms had led the empire astray, and that running the state strictly according to ancient Confucian principles would bring peace and prosperity. Buoyed by this groundswell of support, the 50-year-old Wang Mang toppled the boy emperor and seized the throne. He was the first non-Han emperor to rule in 200 years. It must have seemed like the Han era was gone for good, crippled by corruption and mismanagement. However, Wang Mang's rule was an unmitigated disaster. Since he had usurped the throne, he was terrified of delegating power, fearing someone else might do the same to him. Consequently, he tried to make every state decision himself, which paralyzed the government. When it came to applying his bold ideas, he faced further issues. It turned out that administering an empire required more than choosing proper court music and temple ceremonies. A Qing dynasty historian later wrote that Wang Mang did not know how to comfort or guide the people, choosing instead to deceive them until he was hated by everyone. The empire was collapsing, but Wang Mang buried his head in the past, believing that restoring old government structures would naturally bring peace. He focused day and night on ceremony rather than urgent state affairs. He also attempted radical reforms, such as banning private land ownership, which caused significant unrest. But his true undoing came from one of China's deadliest forces, the Yellow River. As we have seen, the Yellow River was dangerous, changing its course and bursting its banks roughly every century to wash away everything in its path. As fate would have it, this centennial disaster struck while Wang Mang sat on the throne. The new emperor was completely unprepared. Peasants who lost their homes felt abandoned, and their resentment reached a fever pitch, sparking revolts nationwide. The most powerful rebels were the Red Eyebrows, named for the red paint they smeared on their foreheads before battle. The chaos and loss of control caused the empire's borders to unravel. The nomadic Xiongnu regained power in the north, and Wang Mang's lack of diplomatic skill caused trouble in the west. Historical records state that the western regions split into 55 kingdoms. After Wang Mang demoted their kings, they rebelled, cut ties with China, and submitted to the Xiongnu. Sensing weakness after a century of subjugation, the Xiongnu launched surprise attacks, seizing the Tarim Basin to the Jade Gate and pouring through the Great Wall into the Hexi corridor. In just a few years, Emperor Wu's gains were undone, with town gates remaining shut even in daylight. Meanwhile, the Red Eyebrow Rebellion was continuing to gain momentum. Vast stretches of the countryside were soon seized by the rebels. Before long, China's nobility allied themselves with the peasant uprising, and every group shared a single, unified objective: to bring down Emperor Wang Mang and reinstate the Han Dynasty. Eventually, the rebellion ignited the streets of the imperial capital, Chang'an. The citizens overpowered Wang Mang's guards, stormed the palace complex, and beheaded the emperor. As the imperial residence burned, Wang Mang's body was dismembered, and his severed head was transported to Wancheng, the temporary capital of the Han forces, to be displayed on the city wall. The public's rage was so intense that they eventually pulled the head down from its display and kicked it through the streets like a football. The capital of Chang'an was subsequently occupied by the Red Eyebrows. Although their leaders attempted to maintain discipline, the city's food supplies quickly evaporated, leading the rebels to riot and steal. They torched many of Chang'an's remaining palaces and pillaged the city for days. By the year 25 AD, the Han Dynasty was officially restored under a new emperor named Guangwu, but the former capital of Chang'an was left as nothing but smoking rubble and the blackened skeletons of buildings. An anonymous Chinese poet, stumbling upon the ruins of an old palace, penned a lamentation for the site. While we cannot be certain which specific ruin he visited, it may well have been the ancient imperial capital as it stood in ashes. He wrote, "Wind howls in the pines, the rats fly at my approach and hide under the old tiles. What monarch once had this palace built, of which there only remain ruins on a mountainside? The owner of this palace had beautiful dancers who are today one with the cold dust. Of all this pomp, of all this glory, remains a marble horse lying in the grass. I should like to express my great sadness in an enduring poem, but I weep and my pencil trembles." The restored Emperor Guangwu decided to relocate his capital eastward to the city of Luoyang. This geographic shift is why historians divide the era into the Western Han and the Eastern Han, or simply the former and later Han. Guangwu's reign represented a fresh start and another opportunity to build a stable Chinese empire capable of enduring through time. However, a series of trials would soon arrive to determine whether the lessons from the fall of the former Han had actually been learned. These tests would decide if this new incarnation of the empire would survive, or if it, too, would end in fire and ash. The new capital of Luoyang was a stunning location. The shallow Gu River ran directly past its walls, diverting into a defensive moat, while the Luo River flowed about 2 kilometers to the south, spanned by a floating bridge made of boats. In the distance, the blue peaks of the Mang Hills looked down over the city. A Han-era poem from the 2nd century describes the vibrant, bustling streets of Luoyang beneath the shade of leafy trees. Along the high road at the city of Luoyang, peach trees and plum trees grow, flower matched by flower, leaf touching leaf. A spring wind rises from the northeast. Flowers and leaves gently nod and sway. Off the road, somebody's daughter comes carrying a basket to gather silkworms for you. Luoyang had served as an important holy city for centuries. Although it was physically smaller than Chang'an, roughly one-third of its size, its position near the rivers and at the crossing point of various major canals gave it superior economic connections. It was also situated further from the empire's frontiers, making it somewhat safer than the smoking ruin that was the former capital. Once the new capital was established, China spent much of the 1st century rebuilding following the fall of the former Han and the devastation caused by Wang Mang's disastrous leadership. Massive construction projects were launched to dredge the bottom of the Yellow River and dig drainage canals to prevent future catastrophic floods. New palaces were erected in Luoyang to house the imperial court and religious institutions. Guangwu commissioned the construction of an altar to the gods of the soils and grains, and he ordered the entire imperial library to be moved to Luoyang. It required 2,000 carts to transport all the books contained in these libraries across the country to the new capital. A poem written by the historian Ban Gu around the year 65 AD celebrates the new Han emperor's achievement in transforming the old city. He refurbished Luoyang city, enhancing its imposing grandeur, making resplendent its order and proportion. He made the Han capitals shine through the empire, controlling all 8 directions. Within the imperial city, the palaces were glittering and bright. The courtyards were divinely beautiful. By the year 36 AD, Guangwu had successfully crushed the Red Eyebrow Rebellion as well as any warlords who still resisted his rule. He announced that the official imperial color would henceforth be red, and he would govern under the element of fire. He had restored the Han Dynasty to power, but the empire was now a significantly weakened state. The long era of chaos had drained its wealth, and in the north, the Xiongnu had re-emerged as a power to be reckoned with. The Chinese general Ban Kao was assigned the task of reclaiming the Hexi corridor and securing the western regions once more. This struggle required decades of effort. Ban Kao painstakingly pushed the Xiongnu back along the Hexi corridor, reclaiming the old, crumbling walls as he advanced. By the year 91, the Han Empire was once again in control of the deserts and the trade routes that ran through them. This reopening of the route to the west occurred at a uniquely interesting moment in world history. During the decades since the Han had lost control of the western regions, a new power known as the Kushan Empire had risen in Central Asia. By the mid-1st century, this Buddhist empire had expanded to cover much of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and northern India. This was significant because it created a stable and unified territory that stretched across Central Asia. Here is the rewritten script for Chunk 16. Bordering the Kushan Empire to the west was the Parthian Empire, a massive territory spanning Iran, much of the Middle East, and parts of Turkey. Yet, the Han Chinese heard rumors of a civilization even further west that rivaled their own grandeur, a mysterious, wealthy empire surrounding a vast inland sea. For the first time in history, 4 major empires created an unbroken chain stretching all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. General Ban Kao understood the massive potential this unique historical alignment offered. In the year 97, he dispatched one of his most reliable subordinates, a man named Gan Ying, on a mission. His orders were to travel as far west as possible to gather intelligence on this distant superpower, known to them only as De Qin. Gan Ying spent months traversing the Hexi corridor, passing through the Jade Gate, and crossing the shifting dunes of the Taklamakan Desert. From there, he navigated the dangerous, snowy mountain passes to reach the high valleys of the Kushan Empire. His journey likely took him across the arid landscapes of Pakistan and past the snow-capped mountains of Iran. He then crossed the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, passing the still-standing city of Babylon and the crumbling ruins of the ancient Sumerian and Assyrian civilizations. Finally, he arrived at the frontiers of Qin, the empire we know today as Rome. Gan Ying later compiled a detailed report of everything he discovered about this exotic land. He noted that their territory stretched for thousands of li, containing over 400 walled cities and dozens of smaller vassal kingdoms. He observed that their city walls were built of stone and that they maintained a network of plastered and whitewashed postal relay stations. The landscape was filled with pine and cypress trees, along with a wide variety of other plants. The customs of the Romans fascinated Gan Ying, and he took meticulous notes. He reported that the men shaved their heads and wore embroidered clothing, while women traveled in screened coaches. He also described small, white-roofed carts drawn by single horses, noting that the movement of carriages was accompanied by the beating of drums and the raising of flags and banners. He was particularly amazed by their political system, though the account given to him was likely an idealized version. He wrote that their kings were not permanent rulers. Instead, they selected the most worthy man to lead. If the kingdom suffered unexpected disasters, the leader was unceremoniously dismissed and replaced, and the deposed leader would accept his demotion without anger. However, Gan Ying never actually set foot in the city of Rome. He reached the coastline of a great sea, likely the Persian Gulf or perhaps the Mediterranean itself, where Parthian sailors discouraged him from going further. They issued a dire warning, telling him that if the winds were unfavorable, the voyage could take 2 years. They claimed that anyone traveling by sea had to carry 3 years' worth of supplies and that the vast ocean caused men to die of homesickness. It is quite possible the Parthians simply wanted to protect their lucrative position as middlemen in the trade between Rome and China. On the other hand, Gan Ying might have simply made this story up. Exhausted by his long trek, he may have looked at the waves and decided to fabricate an excuse to return to his family, reasoning that no one back home would ever know the truth. At that moment in history, the Han and Roman empires stood as equals on opposite ends of the Eurasian landmass. They were remarkably comparable in terms of population, size, and social complexity. While Rome controlled an area of approximately 5 million square kilometers, the Han commanded 6 million. In terms of population, Rome governed nearly 56 million people, while the Han governed over 60 million. It is estimated that around the time of Gan Ying's epic expedition, half of the entire human race lived within the borders of either the Roman or Han empires. Gan Ying was perhaps the first person in recorded history to travel the full length of the route that would become globally significant, the Silk Road. Named after the massive quantities of Chinese silk that flowed along it, this highway connected east and west and eventually facilitated the spread of innovations like porcelain, paper, the compass, and gunpowder across the globe. The establishment of the Silk Road remains one of the Han Dynasty's most enduring achievements. However, storm clouds were already gathering. The days of the Han Empire were numbered, but the cause of their downfall would not come from the frozen wastelands of the north. Instead, the threat grew from the very heart of the empire, right inside the Imperial Palace. To an observer, the Han court was a place of supreme elegance and refinement, where wealthy nobles in exquisite clothing mingled amidst the scent of incense and the sound of fine music. In reality, the court was a battlefield as deadly as any desert frontier. It was an open secret that anyone with access to the emperor could use that trust to amass immense personal wealth and power, leading people to stop at nothing to gain influence. The Imperial Palace was one of the most heavily guarded locations on Earth. Very few people were permitted to enter, and no men were allowed to remain within its walls after sunset. By the 2nd century AD, only 2 groups had regular, intimate access to the emperor, and they were locked in a bitter war for control. These 2 factions were the palace women and the palace eunuchs. The eunuchs were generally despised and distrusted by society at large, yet they held the absolute trust of the emperor. Simply put, a eunuch is a man who has been castrated. In ancient China, this procedure was usually a punishment for crimes such as adultery or promiscuous behavior. If the man survived the procedure, he was forced to work in the Imperial Palace as a special attendant, which was essentially a form of high-status slavery. In rarer instances, some men volunteered to become eunuchs in exchange for a secure career on the palace staff. There were several reasons why eunuchs were so highly valued as imperial servants. One primary reason was the sexual jealousy of emperors who had multiple wives and consorts. They considered it too risky to have uncastrated male guards or attendants near the women. However, another major factor was the paranoia of the emperors. It was commonly believed that because a eunuch could not produce sons to inherit his position, he would be less likely to use his influence to grab personal power. Crucially for the future of Han China, this belief turned out to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The practice of using eunuchs as servants to rulers dates back at least 3,000 years, but in the later Han Dynasty, their usage as palace attendants increased dramatically. Before long, the imperial court was home to more than 2,000 eunuchs. They filled every domestic role imaginable, acting as fetchers, carriers, bodyguards, nurses, butlers, maids, and cooks. Crucially, until a young emperor reached adulthood, these were virtually the only men he would ever see. Because of this unique, privileged access to the inner court, these thousands of servants soon organized into a type of shadow government operating within the imperial palace. The second rival faction consisted of the palace women, specifically the Empress Dowagers. A dowager was the widow of a deceased emperor. While her husband was alive, she held a supreme position of adoration and influence within the royal court. However, once the emperor died and his body was interred in the stone tombs on Baimeng Hill, the Empress Dowager's position became incredibly insecure. To maintain her influence, she had to be cunning and gather allies. In the polygamous society of early imperial China, an emperor could have numerous wives, meaning the court could quickly become overpopulated with Empress Dowagers, each fighting and jockeying to hold onto her power. These two factions, the eunuchs and the dowagers, battled just as fiercely within their own ranks as they did against each other. Dowagers were constantly poisoning rivals and their children, with several even facing trial for attempting to use witchcraft against one another. Meanwhile, the eunuchs plotted against each other endlessly. Over the following century, however, both groups would sink their teeth into every ruler of China. The result was that the emperor became nothing more than a chess piece in this complex and deadly game. The emperors of the 2nd century were not selected for their skill or popularity, but simply for how easy they would be to control. For this reason, the throne was very often given to children. One extreme example of this is Emperor Shang, the 5th ruler of the later Han Dynasty. He was a newborn baby, crowned in the year 106 AD at an age of little more than 100 days old. His mother was a dowager empress and wife to the previous emperor. All of her other children had died under mysterious circumstances, quite probably murdered by other jealous empress dowagers. Now, the tiny Emperor Shang was her best hope at maintaining her status at court. If her surviving child could be emperor, her position was assured. Historical records provide detailed descriptions of the pomp and ceremony involved in a Chinese imperial coronation. We can imagine the crashing drums and gongs, the marching soldiers, the music, and the chanting of ceremonial words all swirling around the oblivious newborn emperor. He lay in his crib with his tiny fists balled, crying in fear and confusion. As was customary, the new emperor was gifted a scepter carved of jade and the ancient, legendary weapon known as the sword that slew the snake, which had belonged to the first emperor, Han Geazu. Perhaps these items were placed directly in the baby's crib, or perhaps his mother or another attendant was there to hold them for him. The tiny infant was also presented with the formal documents of accession written on fine paper and the Great Seal of State tied with its ribbon. Then the crowd would have burst out in rapturous cries, shouting, 10,000 years, 10,000 years, as the baby wailed and screamed in the center of the great hall. Tragically, Emperor Shang would rule for only a matter of months before he also died. His cause of death is officially unknown, but not hard to guess. The 5th emperor of the later Han never even reached his first birthday. 2 decades later, in the year 125, it was the eunuchs' turn. They led a successful coup to replace another Empress Dowager and her son, placing the 10-year-old Emperor Shun on the throne. They were slightly more successful, and Emperor Shun reigned for 19 years. However, when his own son was crowned at 2 years old, the child died mysteriously after only 6 months on the throne. These are just two of the countless examples of intrigue, murder, and plotting by these factions that turned the imperial court into a slaughterhouse throughout the 2nd century. In the rare instances when an emperor actually reached adulthood, they were encouraged to stay far away from the business of ruling. Instead, they were usually directed toward a life of indolence and pleasure. As the 2nd century wore on and weak young emperor followed weak young emperor, the power of these factions only increased. Ultimately, it would be the eunuchs who truly seized the reins of power. In the year 159, a group of eunuchs at court were even granted royal titles. 7 years after that, university students in Luoyang took to the streets to protest against corrupt government officials. Acting on the advice of the eunuchs, the emperor had all the involved students arrested. One county magistrate named Li Yun even submitted a petition urging the emperor to curb the eunuchs' power. In this letter, he asked what many in the empire must have been thinking. Is the emperor blind? The emperor responded by having Li executed. Soon, a group of 12 eunuchs controlled virtually everything that happened in the Imperial Palace, led by an inner faction of 4 individuals. One popular song written around this time mocked the enormous power these eunuchs had gathered. Zhu sits by himself without match, Su is a lying wolf, Tang's power is as prevalent as falling rain, who can reverse the decision of heaven? Meanwhile, outside the insular world the Imperial Palace had become, the fabric of the empire was truly beginning to come apart. A number of problems plagued the Han Chinese throughout the 2nd century. One of these was the continued presence of northern nomads on the empire's borders. The empire had beaten the Xiongnu a 2nd time, but now, to their dismay, a new group known as the Xianbei had swooped in to occupy those lands. This new group was every bit as powerful a challenge as the Xiongnu had been. The Book of Later Han recalls that since the Xiongnu fled, the Xianbei became powerful and prosperous, occupying the former territory. They could claim 100,000 soldiers, skilled and strong, and their ideas and understanding were steadily increasing. They also employed renegades from the Han to serve as masters of strategy. In the sharpness of their weapons and the strength of their horses, they were even more dangerous than the Xiongnu. However, it wasn't until the reign of Emperor Ling that the true disintegration of the Han Empire began. Ling was a model specimen of the kind of young, lazy ruler that had become the norm for imperial China. He came to the throne at the age of 12, put in place by a powerful Empress Dowager. Emperor Ling was brought up by the eunuchs at court, now led by 2 men named Zhao Zhang and Zhang Rang. They had so much influence over his upbringing that the Book of Han records the young emperor stating, "Regular attendant Zhang is my father, and regular attendant Zhao is my mother." When he came of age, Emperor Ling was more inclined to spend time with his palace women than actually run the state. He especially enjoyed creating role-playing scenarios to engage in with his beautiful consorts. As recorded in the Book of Later Han, the emperor ordered a market set up in the harem apartments and had all his women trade there. They robbed and fought one another while the emperor, dressed as a peddler, joined the crowd to drink wine and feast with them. Ling was also financially irresponsible and increased the burden of taxation on the people to fund his lavish lifestyle. The emperor was in the habit of hoarding money and treasure for himself. He arranged for all valuable goods from the empire and all tributes sent in from the commanderies and kingdoms to go first to the inner palace, where he took a share for himself and called it his commission. Hatred of this corruption spawned peasant rebellions, which quickly emptied the imperial treasury. Increasingly strapped for cash, the empire began offering minor titles and positions to its wealthiest citizens in exchange for payment. This was intended as a short-term measure to fund the armies needed to put down the rebellions. But since the rebellions were in protest against corruption in the first place, this policy had the effect of pouring gasoline on a fire. Matters were made considerably worse when Emperor Ling started selling high political offices for money. Even the position of chief of police in the imperial capital was put up for sale. This policy severely damaged both the effectiveness and the legitimacy of the Han civil service. Corruption now trickled down to every level, from the royal court to the lowest officials. As the Book of Later Han recalls, during the reign of Emperor Ling, the inspectors of provinces and the heads of commanderies and kingdoms were greedy as jackals and tigers, oppressing the people in the most cruel and ruthless fashion. Most of the resulting rebellions were easily put down, but as the decades wore on, along with the simmering intrigue in the imperial court, the uprisings got worse. Some of these became truly enormous, and perhaps the worst was the rebellion of the Qian people. The Qian were an ethnic minority who lived in the mountainous regions of the Tibetan Plateau, in a province known as Liang. This was an arid and rocky place in the northwest of China. Liang has its back to the Tibetan mountains in the west and south and stares out into the Gobi Desert to the north. It was the gate to the Hexi corridor and the staging ground for caravans setting out through the deserts. The Qian were a hardy people who herded yak and lived in fortress villages in the stony hills, cultivating narrow plains along creeks and mountain terraces. They built strong houses from granite fieldstones and tall, narrow stone watchtowers to defend against attacks. The first Qian rebellions were put down easily by the empire, but they were only the first in a long line of revolts that would be a thorn in the side of imperial China for the rest of the Han Dynasty. By the middle of the 2nd century, the Qian rebellions had reached such a pitch that the empire was considering extreme measures, tactics that we today would recognize as ethnic cleansing. A letter from one general to the emperor illustrates this clearly. "If I have 5,000 cavalry and 10,000 foot soldiers with 3,000 carts for baggage, in 3 winters and 2 summers, I can break these people and settle them." The emperor gave his permission for the campaign, and a year later, the general wrote back triumphantly that after just 1 year, with less than half the money expended, the remnant enemy were reduced to ashes and on the point of total destruction. These cruel reprisals against the empire's ethnic minorities only hardened the hearts of the common people. Before long, the state was locked in a number of rolling insurgencies in the west, which combined with the peasant rebellions in the east to further sap its strength. Combined with these was also a new kind of rebellion, one that the Chinese authorities were completely unprepared to deal with: the devout religious crusades of the Yellow Turbans. Religion in China around this time is a complicated subject. In the royal court, the most influential ideology was Confucianism. Confucianism wasn't exactly a religion, but more a series of guidelines about how a society should be ordered and run. However, in the countryside, religious beliefs were extremely diverse from region to region. To illustrate the sheer variety of these spiritual practices, the records of the Grand Historian highlights distinct regional differences. For instance, shamans in the Liang region venerated heaven and earth, while those in Qin directed their worship toward the 5 emperors, the Lord of the Clouds and the Lord of Fire. Elsewhere, mystics paid homage to spirits dwelling beneath the floorboards, the giver of gruel, and the ancestors of sorcery. However, around 500 BC, a new belief system known as Taoism began to take root among the rural peasantry. In contrast to the human-centric moral guidelines of Confucianism, Taoism focused on nature, envisioning a society that aligned with the Tao, the fundamental, unifying way of existence. By the year 180 AD, roughly a dozen years into Emperor Ling's reign, these beliefs coalesced into a formal order called the Taiping sect. They were led by Zhang Jiao, a man who claimed to possess miraculous healing abilities. Historical accounts view his methods with intense scorn, describing the rituals as ineffective, wicked deceptions that preyed upon the stupidity and confusion of the desperate. Despite the skepticism of historians, imperial officials soon grew alarmed by the fanatical devotion Zhang Jiao inspired. They urged the state to crush this emerging cult, but Emperor Ling, preoccupied with hunting expeditions, and the women of his harem failed to act. This negligence proved dangerous, as the zealot Zhang Jiao was secretly plotting to dismantle the imperial order. He appointed 36 of his disciples as military commanders, established a shadow government, and even conspired with palace eunuchs to overthrow the emperor. When the conspiracy was finally exposed and arrest orders were issued, the mystic's influence had already grown too powerful. Zhang Jiao's followers immediately mobilized, seizing local garrisons by surprise and sweeping across the nation. Capitalizing on widespread resentment toward the ruling class, the rebels identified themselves by wrapping yellow fabric around their heads, earning the name the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Although the uprising ultimately failed, crushed by the overwhelming force of the Imperial Army and ending with Zhang Jiao's death in 184 AD, it left permanent scars on the dynasty. The primary consequence was a total collapse of trust. Commoners no longer believed the empire could protect them. Towns ravaged by the Yellow Turbans formed independent militias for self-defense, while regional governors seized greater authority, causing central power to crumble. Another major side effect was the rising prominence of the Liang troops. These soldiers had spent their careers in the rugged mountains, brutally suppressing the constant uprisings of the Qian people. They were battle-hardened and merciless. Now, however, they were being deployed not against foreign tribes, but against Chinese peasants in the imperial heartland. The Liang units became a source of terror for both the common people and other imperial soldiers, and they began to recognize the power that this fear provided. Commanding these fearsome Liang troops was a general named Dong Zhuo. History remembers him as a sadistic butcher and the tyrant who drove the final stake into the Han Empire's heart. His meteoric ascent invites comparisons to Julius Caesar. Though born on opposite ends of the continent less than a century apart, both men possessed a ruthless understanding of how power truly functioned. Dong Zhuo hailed from Lintao in Liang province, the same arid, rocky frontier where the Qiang tribes refused to bow to imperial rule. This unforgiving landscape forged an equally unforgiving man. Growing up witnessing the brutal suppression of rebellions, Dong Zhuo developed a natural talent for violence and became an expert in horseback archery. In his early 20s, he joined the Guards of the Feathered Forest, an elite cadet corps tasked with protecting the emperor. During his months in the capital, he likely received his first taste of supreme authority, perhaps dreaming of one day seizing such power for himself. His time in the city was cut short in 166 AD when another Qiang revolt necessitated his return to the frontier. Alongside his fellow guards, he engaged in a bloody campaign, torching villages and inflicting collective punishment on civilians to crush those who defied the empire. While specific details of his involvement are scarce, his performance sufficiently impressed his superiors to earn him a reward of 9,000 rolls of fine silk. Understanding the value of buying loyalty, Dong Zhuo insisted on distributing these riches among his soldiers. When the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted in the early 180s, the empire placed Dong Zhuo in charge of a massive, seasoned army of these feared Liang troops. For his military successes during that crisis, Dong Zhuo was eventually bestowed with the title of general. Instead of accepting a provincial governorship, Dong Zhuo turned the offer down. His ambitions had grown far too large for such a role. He took his army back to the rugged terrain of Liang province, where they continued their brutal oppression of the Qiang people. The imperial court, growing anxious about the influence Dong Zhuo held over these troops, summoned him to the capital to serve as minister-steward. While this appeared to be a promotion, it was a transparent attempt to strip him of his military command. Astonishingly, Dong Zhuo refused this order as well, writing to the emperor that his Huangzhang auxiliaries physically clung to his carriage and would not let him depart. He claimed that the Qiang and other non-Chinese tribes possessed evil hearts and the nature of dogs, insisting that he must remain to keep them pacified. Later, a desperate government attempted to recall him again, but met with another refusal. Dong Zhuo replied that after holding command for 10 years, his officers and men had become deeply attached to him. He stated that they appreciated his generous care and were always ready to obey, begging permission to lead them north to defend the frontier. Despite the polite phrasing, this was a direct challenge to imperial authority, proving that his army's loyalty belonged solely to him. Having led, paid, and fed these soldiers for years in the empire's wildest regions, he had become a father figure to them. Much like the legions of Julius Caesar, these Liang troops owed no allegiance to the weak child kings of the empire, but only to the man who rode at their front. This dynamic was poised to destroy the fragile order of the Han Dynasty. As the reign of Emperor Ling neared its end, the Book of Later Han recorded several dark omens. On the 7th day of the second month, a solar eclipse occurred, followed by an earthquake in the summer. By the 6th month, a black vapor resembling a dragon descended upon the eastern court, and in the autumn, a dark rainbow materialized in the courtyard of the Jade Hall. When the emperor consulted his counselors, the prognosis was grim. One wise man warned that a rainbow signaled universal anger and that 400 years of government were ending. He blamed the clique of concubines and eunuchs for deceiving the emperor's celestial intelligence and urged the ruler to ruthlessly purge these evil associates. The emperor reportedly just sighed and walked away. These advisors were subsequently imprisoned, exiled, and assassinated by the eunuchs. By this time, the public despised the eunuchs, who had amassed staggering wealth and were known to manipulate the emperor. They built mansions that rivaled the Imperial Palace itself. On one occasion, the emperor wished to climb the observation terrace at the Palace of Perpetual Peace, but the eunuchs feared he would see their lavish homes. They sent an official named Xiongnu to warn him that if the Son of Heaven climbed high, his people would be scattered and impoverished. From then on, the emperor avoided the tower. In the year 189, Emperor Ling fell critically ill and died, triggering a power struggle between the eunuchs and the Empress Dowager's faction. This resulted in the coronation of a 13-year-old boy, but his reign would be short. Seeing a chance to eliminate the eunuch advisors, a group of military commanders plotted a coup. Among them was the ruthless tyrant of Liang, Dong Zhuo. Upon receiving the invitation, he responded with glee, declaring that while bursting an abscess is painful, it is better than harboring a malignant tumor. He announced he would sound the bells and drums and march to Luoyang to clear away the evil. However, Dong Zhuo arrived at the capital only to see flames rising over the southern palace. The conspirators had already struck. The eunuchs were slaughtered in their homes, and many young men were killed simply because they lacked beards and were mistaken for targets. Records even describe officials stripping naked to prove to soldiers that they were not castrated. A group of eunuchs fled into the hills with the young Emperor Xiao and his brother, but Dong Zhuo's soldiers intercepted them. The eunuchs drowned themselves in a river, and the princes were returned to the capital. It was a military coup, and Dong Zhuo now held the true power. Although he occupied Luoyang, Dong Zhuo feared the combined strength of the imperial armies. To project false strength, he ordered half his men to sneak out of the city at night and march back in during the day with great fanfare, creating the illusion of constant reinforcements. 3 days after taking the city, he deposed the 13-year-old Emperor Xiao, fearing the boy was too close to adulthood to control. In his place, he installed the 8-year-old half-brother, crowning him Emperor Qian, the final emperor of the Han Age. Following the coronation, Dong Zhuo forced the former emperor to drink poison and issued a chilling decree. Anyone obstructing his grand design would face military law. The corrupt rule of the eunuchs had been exchanged for a military tyranny, marking the end of the Han Golden Age. Dong Zhuo's actions outraged the empire's nobility. As he held the boy emperor hostage, dozens of kingdoms declared independence. A resistance coalition formed under Yuan Shao, who camped at a yellow river crossing north of Luoyang. Joined by his brother and other former officials, their forces swelled by the Chinese New Year of 190. Their colorful tents covered the plains, posing a lethal threat to the usurper. Realizing he could not defend Luoyang against an all-out assault, Dong Zhuo decided on a drastic course of action. He would flee west to the ancient capital of Chang'an, taking his soldiers and the civilian population with him, and burn Luoyang to the ground. His men ransacked the city, looting palaces, temples, and homes. They raided the countryside and even sent the subordinate General Lu Bu to tear open the imperial tombs at Beimeng to steal their treasures. The vast imperial libraries were incinerated. Illiterate soldiers used rare silk manuscripts as tent screens and umbrellas. Of the collection that once required 2,000 carts to transport, barely 70 carts survived, a loss of over 96% of the empire's books. Dong Zhuo melted down the great bronze statues into poor-quality coins, crashing the economy. The Book of Later Han states that everything within 100 kilometers was obliterated. Ironically, Emperor Guangwu had restored the dynasty under the sign of fire. Now, fire consumed its capital, leaving only ash and ruin for the arriving rebel lords. In Chang'an, Dong Zhuo attempted to govern what remained of the empire, but his position was weak. The city was isolated, and renewed Qian rebellions made his home province of Liang ungovernable. With the economy dead, his rule relied entirely on looting, essentially making him a pirate emperor, while half the country rose against him. Associates quickly realized the situation was hopeless. Historical accounts describe macabre banquets where Dong Zhuo gorged himself while prisoners were tortured or boiled alive before sickened guests. His gluttony led to immense obesity. Paranoia drove him to build a massive fortress on the Wei River, stocked with 30 years of supplies. He boasted that he would either master the empire or live out his days there in comfort. He was wrong. The final parallel with Julius Caesar emerged on May 22, 192. His bodyguard, Lu Bu, conspired with other generals to end the tyranny. As Dong Zhuo rode his chariot to a morning inspection, the plotters struck, stabbing him to death. Lu Bu and his allies immediately slaughtered Dong Zhuo's entire family and entourage at both the capital and his fortress. The tyrant's body was simply abandoned in the street. It is said that his killers mocked him by inserting a candle wick into his navel and setting it aflame. Legend claims he was so obese at the time of his death that the candle burned for days, fueled entirely by the fat of his stomach. The villain of this chapter had been defeated, yet the devastation he wrought could not be undone. By this point, the boy Emperor Qian was only 11 years old, and was passed like a pawn between the various warlords fighting for control of Chang'an after Dong Zhuo's demise. In early 195, two of these rival chieftains burned down the Imperial Palace at Chang'an while battling for dominion over the capital. Now, both of China's great imperial cities lay in ashes. Later that same year, at the age of 14, Emperor Qian managed to escape Chang'an, sneaking out through the gates in disguise with a handful of loyal attendants. They fled across the country in an ox cart, dodging roaming bandit gangs and warlord raiding parties that were actively tearing China apart. The historian Wei Shu records that during this journey, the child emperor commanded no respect from his guards. Whenever the Son of Heaven met with his ministers, common soldiers would hide in the bushes to gawk, pushing and shoving one another just to get a look. When he finally reached his once beautiful home of Luoyang, Emperor Qian likely felt the same sorrow described by the poet Cao Zhai mentioned earlier. From the crest of the Bay Mang Hills, he would have seen the charred ruins of the imperial capital stretched out below him. By this time, Luoyang had been a ruin for 5 years. Ivy and brambles would already be reclaiming the blackened stones of the city's palaces. Young Emperor Qian and his attendants attempted to move back into the shattered palace. They patched up a small section of the imperial residence to make it barely habitable, shuffling through heaps of ash and broken masonry. Human remains still littered the palace halls amidst the scorched skeletons of buildings, where thick mats of thorns now grew. The emperor's attendants spent their days scrounging for wild grains among the wreckage. Some starved to death, while others were killed by desperate, lawless survivors still trying to exist among the ruins. This tragic situation persisted for a year, until a warlord named Cao finally arrived to rescue the child emperor. By then, the ruler of all Chinese people and holder of the mandate of heaven must have looked like any other soot-stained orphan wandering the broken streets of Luoyang. General Cao Cao made a final attempt to reunify China under the restored name of Han, and he came very close. However, he was defeated at the Battle of Red Cliff in the winter of 208, involving roughly 300,000 soldiers along the banks and waters of the Yangtze River. Red Cliff has been cited as the largest naval battle in history. Cao Cao's failure sealed the fate of the Han Dynasty. China fractured into the three kingdoms, and a new historical era began. Emperor Qian was treated fairly by the victors. He was appointed as a duke and allowed to live out his life in peace and comfort. The young boy emperor, the last of the Han, died peacefully at age 53. In his medieval historical epic, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the writer Luo Guanzhang summarizes this period with a famous sentiment. The empire long divided must unite, long united must divide, thus it has ever been. The Han Dynasty was a remarkably successful ancient empire, yet it was ultimately destroyed by the corruption of its politicians and power struggles within the royal court. Today, it lends its name to the world's largest ethnic group, the Han Chinese, who comprise nearly one-fifth of the global population with 1.3 billion people. The divided realm of China would eventually reunite under a new emperor, but that is a tale for another time. The ruins of Luoyang remained in the fields beneath the Bay Mang Hills, overgrown with thorns for decades before anyone returned to repopulate the area. The poet Yang Xuanji paints a vivid image of Luoyang's appearance following the collapse of the Han Dynasty. He described how the inner and outer walls had crumbled and how palaces and chambers had fallen. Monasteries and temples were reduced to ash, while pagodas and stupas lay in ruins. Mugwort covered the walls, and thorns lined the lanes. Wild beasts burrowed into overgrown stairways, and hunting birds nested in the courtyard trees. Vagrants and herd boys loitered in the avenues, while old farmers harvested broomcorn millet near the twin gateways. Over half a century after the burning of Luoyang, the poet Zhang Zai visited Mount Bay Mang, where the tombs of the great Han kings had stood for centuries. However, he found nothing but ruins. Dong Zhuo's men had destroyed and looted many of the tombs, and grave robbers had finished the job during the years of chaos. The mausoleum walls had crumbled, animals had dug burrows between the fallen stones, and children now played among the ornate carvings. Zhang Zai wrote of asking whose graves these were, only to be told they belonged to the lords of the Han house. At the end of the dynasty, chaos and destruction had risen. Thieves and robbers acted like wild dogs and tigers, and the earth was despoiled by the masses. In the inner corridors, secluded doors had been flung open, and precious gems had been pilfered. The funeral parks and resting chambers were laid to waste. No segments of the surrounding walls remained. Boys climbed on tomb pathways, and foxes and hares burrowed inside. Everything was overgrown with weeds and unswept. The abandoned mounds were plowed over, with common folk tending gardens on the hills. He wrote of his sadness and sorrow, lamenting the distant past. The ruins of the Han Dynasty stood broken and empty in the fields, a testament to the greatness of former ages and the fleeting nature of all things. We close this chapter with extracts from the 19 pieces of old poetry. These ancient works likely had multiple authors, though tradition attributes them to the 1st century Han poet Mei Sheng. These poems are melancholy meditations on transience. As you listen, try to visualize what it must have felt like to watch the peace and prosperity of your homeland torn apart by corruption and greed. Picture the life you knew being destroyed by the hunger of warlords who profited from death and destruction. And imagine watching the vast stores of the Imperial Library's centuries of accumulated wisdom turning into fire right in front of you. You are forced to watch as the lush, green capital of Luoyang is consumed, with flames reaching up to taste the darkness of the evening sky. Visualize the magnificent heart of this massive empire crumbling down until only smoke and ash remain, marking the devastating and violent end of a 4th-century era. As the autumn wind rattles the grass in every direction, the landscape feels empty and barren. Both success and ruin have their own distinct seasons. The fortress in the east rises majestically, its defensive towers stretching across the horizon, while a spiraling gale kicks up and trembles the earth. As the seasons cycle through without stopping and the year rushes swiftly toward its close, I steer my carriage toward the eastern entrance. Looking out from a distance, I spot the burial grounds north of the fortifications where men who passed away ages ago now rest. They are held by a long darkness, sleeping for thousands of years without ever stirring. Light and shadow shift endlessly, and years disappear as quickly as morning dew in the sunlight, proving that human existence is merely a brief visit. Those who once grieved are now grieved for in their turn. The departed have left us and cannot speak, so we must direct our affection toward the living who are still here. Stepping away from the city gates, the view ahead is filled with nothing but burial mounds and tombs. Even the ancient graves have been plowed over into farm fields. A human life rarely lasts 100 years, yet it seems to carry a millennium of sorrow as the year coldly fades away. Leaning against the gate, consumed by sadness, tears soak the double doors. The desire to ride back to the village of home is strong, but looking behind, there is simply no